Welcome to the Environmental Leadership Chronicles, a podcast brought to you by the California Association of Environmental Professionals. This is a second episode in a series focusing on current events related to the California Environmental Quality Act, known as CEQA, which is intended to inform government decision makers and the public about the potential environmental effects of proposed activities and to prevent significant, avoidable environmental damage. In this episode, we have a panel featuring Andrew Keatts, Laurel Blackson, and Kristin Blackson, and is moderated by Laurel Glass Lees. The panel offers diversity and perspectives on CEQA as it relates to the California Supreme Court ruling regarding the UC Berkeley housing case. Andrew is a managing editor of Voice of San Diego. He sees land use coverage as a way to make sense of the complex land use decisions governments make while explaining how those decisions affect the daily lives of San Diegans. Howard is an urban designer, author, lecturer, and educator with over 30 years of experience. He works with AVRP Studios in San Diego, managing the design and entitlement of mixed-use projects and codes for public and private clients across North America. And we welcome Kristin back to join the panel. She is Senior CEQA Project Manager with Harrison Associates, a member of the California AEP State Board, and co-chair of the Legislative Committee. Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoy this episode.
Hi, I'm Laurel, and welcome to Environmental Leadership Chronicles. This is the second in our CEQA series and the first in a panel experience. We have an awesome panel for you today to talk about our reflections on the recent UC Berkeley, California Supreme Court case and the recent unanimously approved Senate Bill 118. So I'm going to give a quick background on that to bring our listeners up to speed. And then each of our panelists are going to describe how they're a little bit biased when it comes to this topic. And we'll go into an open discussion from there. I'm really excited to see what everybody has to say. We've got all sorts of opinions to discuss. So firstly, in the UC Berkeley, California Supreme Court case, basically CEQA requires public universities to mitigate the environmental impacts of their growth and development, especially in their long-range planning efforts, including student enrollment increases. So to ensure that the University of California sufficiently mitigate significant off-campus impacts related to campus growth and development, the university is required periodically to develop a comprehensive long-range development plan for each campus, based on the academic goals and projected enrollment. This is very similar to plans of development for buildings and like general plans, community plans, et cetera. The plan must be analyzed in an environmental impact report per California Environmental Quality Act. A 2005 EIR analyzed a development plan and projected enrollment increases for the UC Berkeley campus specifically. And opponents claimed that the UC system violated CEQA by increasing enrollment well beyond the growth projected in the 2005 EIR without conducting any further environmental review. And there was a big to-do about it, and it was challenged, and basically the opposers of that issue wanted to not prevent students from enrolling. They wanted to encourage students to attend campus. And very quickly, the legislature via Senate Bill 118 changed how CEQA applies to colleges, providing higher education institutions with an 18-month window to certify court-ordered EIRs before an enrollment freeze can be ordered by a judge. And basically, the key factor here in SB 118 is that the court decided, or the legislature decided, increasing enrollment will not be treated the same way as a building project in terms of evaluating environmental impact. It also allows colleges to consider the environmental impact of their campus population rather than their enrollment. So without getting super technical and diving into that at first, it basically means that UC Berkeley thought that they were going to have to reject over 3,000 students based on CEQA, and SB 118 basically said no. And so all of the students that wanted to enroll can now enroll, period. And the main issue surrounding it was housing and how students were perceived under the California Environmental Quality Act. So let's start, before we dig into how the media responded to this, which was very interesting, let's acknowledge our biases as a panel. I'll start. I am biased because I am a CEQA practitioner. I'm on the board of directors for the California Association of Environmental Professionals, and we help implement CEQA and its underlying principles. We have lobbyists in Sacramento that educate legislators about CEQA, trying to prevent things like this that are happening and the confusion and unintended consequences. And so I'm very opinionated when it comes to CEQA. And I believe Kristin Blackson is too. So I'm going to hand it over to you to discuss your bias as a practitioner.
Ditto. I have the exact same biases. I am a CEQA practitioner, also on the Association of Environmental Professionals State Board, and I serve as the co-chair of our legislative committee. So I have a strong bias because this is what I do, and also my bias is to bring better efficiency to CEQA. So I do have a bias, and it is to do CEQA better all the time. There's mine.
Understood. And let's go to Howard, who's an urban designer. Let's acknowledge your biases.
I'm married to Kristin Blackson, so whatever she says, fine with me. No, I'm kidding. Hi. Thank you.
I wish that was true.
It is true. So anyway, the image behind me is on purpose. I actually met Kristin when she was an environmental manager beginning of the county of San Diego, and I was an urban planner working on a general plan update. This was 20 years ago, and I'm an urban designer working with cities and towns and neighborhoods to try to create great human places that are in balance with nature, that are in balance with economics, that are in balance with, social justice issues as well. So the idea that the bias I have is that CEQA's baseline mitigation point starting at zero is pristine nature. And you can look over my shoulder and there's not a lot of pristine nature in this urban environment. So everything that is done here is measured against a false background or a false context, because there is not pristine nature in our cities. There's man-made habitats, and there's also natural habitats that go together. So my bias is that it doesn't begin with the any idea of human habitation or human occupancy of land that was once pristine nature 400, 500, 1,000 years ago.
Thanks, Howard. I'll also add that he was my professor at UC San Diego Extension for urban planning and development. And I also want to acknowledge that we're all originally starting our work in San Diego. So even though I'm physically located in Santa Barbara, this is more of a San Diego panel. And I'll also add that Howard is not a CEQA practitioner, but is indeed an urban designer. And
However, my background is as a board member of the Downtown Redevelopment Agency. We had to review CEQA documents and review CEQA issues, threats from the unions over hotels, mostly, and then as a practitioner, I got to be hired by places like Kilroy to look at the One Paseo, where the threats from the neighboring shopping center use CEQA to stop it. And then as a county and city of San Diego worker, I had to use CEQA as a tool for public disclosure with that. So I do have quite a bit of CEQA experience, but it's full spectrum. Therefore, I think I have the most complete analysis of it.
Valid. Thank you for sharing. Let's go to Andy, who also has a different perspective.
Yeah, so I'm not a CEQA professional by any stretch of the imagination. I am a newspaper reporter. I cover land use and development and local politics. Each of those specific issues that Howard just listed, I covered each of those. So I'm familiar with CEQA disputes from the perspective of being in the uncomfortable position of trying to be something of an arbiter of those disputes. And so I think my bias is mostly against dishonest public policy arguments. And I think there are a lot of those in the world of CEQA. I think there's a lot of people talking past each other and making bad faith arguments that are predicated on not listening to what people are saying or pretending that the dispute is something other than it really is. We can get into the details on what I mean by those over the course of time. But I will also add that I do not, I work for Voice of San Diego. We're a nonprofit online news website. And unlike many reporters, I do not claim to be objective. I don't think that is a thing that exists. And I acknowledge that openly. We have a whole list of principles that we expect our reporters to abide by, that are important, but that are not the traditional objective standard that reporters, that people learn about in high school. And so that being the case, I'll lay my cards on the table and say that from a policy perspective, I think the state of California and large cities in California have a dire housing shortage. They need to provide much, much, much more housing in already developed urban areas, and that doing so can allow the preservation of pristine nature elsewhere in the state and prevent environmentally ruinous sprawl. And to the extent that CEQA inhibits those two efforts, I think that it is a law that is in need of reform, and I'll be open about that.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that a lot of us, whether we are CEQA practitioners or not, based on recent media attention and ongoing media attention when it comes to CEQA and how it's used as a tool for various reasons, can agree that things need to be improved upon and reformed and evolved over time. So let's start specifically communicating about how CEQA has been characterized related to the UC Berkeley case specifically. I want to open up by quoting an article by the Greenbelt Alliance called UC Berkeley is the latest victim of CEQA misuse. And the quote that I want y'all's reaction to is this win, the fact that the Supreme Court case is allowing increased student enrollment at UC Berkeley, is avoiding an alarming precedent of categorizing students as pollutants. And I would like to start with Kristin. Tell me your reaction to the media's characterization that students are pollutants and that's a wrong way of describing them in environmental law.
Students as pollutants, it causes, I think what it does is, and when Andy said, people talk over each other and they don't, they're not talking about the right things. I think this is an example of bringing things that we don't need to discuss into CEQA, like by labeling students as pollutants. What CEQA does is we focus on physical impacts. So we have to keep the argument there, students as pollutants. What do students do that causes impacts to the environment? It's not students, it is the demand that the school brings to the area. So distinguishing that way, I think, is better than seeing, and then seeing students as pollutants, because it's not a good community argument. We have to work with the community to accommodate these polluters, these awful students. And so, and that's part of Berkeley's problem is, if you go back to them, trying to implement their housing that was described in the 2005 EIR, there's a history of the community not working with the institution to make that work. So that's what I think.
Yeah, and I'll back up to for our young listeners to understand this is basically the media is saying CEQA characterizes students as pollutants, whereas CEQA practitioners assess, as Kristin said, the physical impacts of a thing, of a project. And the project in this case is that UC Berkeley has a lot of students coming, and you need to accommodate them via housing as well. And when you talk about housing, you talk about transportation, vehicle miles traveled, wastewater, water demand, energy demand, everything that goes into a human being occupying a habitat, basically. And it's regardless if it's a student or not, it is a dwelling unit, really, is what I would personally suggest the media should have clarified, is that in this case, they're categorizing dwelling units as pollutants, which, Howard, I'd like to go to you and think, as an urban designer who talks about density and where to place it and why to place it and how to place it. What are your thoughts about students as pollutants versus like dwelling unit as pollutant?
The idea that housing is separate from people is always an interesting, concept to me, because of the many factors that you said. The idea that a dwelling unit is also something to be measured in outer space when it's in relationship to anything, a neighborhood, a city, a campus, block, is and then how you measure that. I think it just shows that the CEQA's bias towards human being is a bad thing to be mitigated for. It shows itself here. But what I want to offer in response to that is the idea of units, and the idea that really the Berkeley's only going to lose about 500 positions rather than 3,500, because they're going to, instead of counting enrollment, they're going to count as students on campus versus the new COVID, post-COVID. Here we are going to be studying remotely. They're still in housing. And so, but the housing isn't directly related to the study area. And so I think that disconnect is just showing the reason why CEQA needs to be reformed from its baseline, expectation that humans are bad for the environment. Just the way that we're having to reform zoning today to say that the basis of all housing is a single family detached home that has to be then, zoned and rezoned to make it into an urban place or an urban city. So the baseline of zoning is based on a flawed concept, and the baseline of CEQA is showing itself here is based on another flawed concept. So we can reform this stuff.
And Andy.
Yeah, I think I'm pretty much with Howard here. I will come to the defense of my media brethren and say that I think they have distilled the essence of this dispute correctly. I understand why a CEQA practitioner would want the increased specificity of the built environment is the thing that is being mitigated against. But I think the reporters are right here to look to the upshot of this, which is 3,000 fewer students. It had the ruling held, not being allowed to go to UC Berkeley. And so the thing that was being mitigated against here, there may be a specific instance in which it isn't students per se, but nonetheless, the impacts fall on those students. And so Go ahead.
I think that the mistake here that the legislators did not come to the defense of the students when they were trying to build the housing. I think that's where the CEQA remedy should have come in. If it was so easy, if they could have in 2 weeks come up with the bill that Laurel described in the beginning, then they should have probably acted faster for housing in Berkeley. Berkeley, when we're talking about housing in Berkeley, this university is particularly is located, in an area with tremendous mass transit. And so we don't have to worry about things that we have to worry about at UC San Diego, which is how are the students going to drive to the campus. That's not the case. Is that you can build housing in Berkeley, and it's the right location to build because they don't need infrastructure like parking garages and parking spaces. They don't already, like Laurel said, they've already accounted for the sewage and the water demand, and everything is still, is there. So,
well, and your point is not just an academic one, in that 3,000 students being excluded from Berkeley based on this ruling, they would not have ceased to exist. Those are highly competitive students. They would have gone down the UC system to the next most competitive school after UC Berkeley. So what is that, UCLA or UC San Diego? UC Santa Barbara, UC Santa Barbara, yeah, right? And then those students that would be pushed down from those would go down the line to the next one. And so so that circles back to Howard's point about the limitations of the study area, that excluding the 3,000 students from Berkeley doesn't exclude them from their global climate impact. And that's just, unless you guys who know more about the law than I do, that's just a fundamental limitation of CEQA that I believe is a serious one when, at least in my experience, when you see legislators talk about CEQA reform or less productively just talk about CEQA in harsh terms, a common response to them is, well, get a load of this guy. He doesn't like the environment. Get a load of this guy. He doesn't care about the climate effects that we're trying to mitigate against. But that's the talking past each other point of this, in that there nothing beneficial was done for the environment by excluding 3,000 students from UC Berkeley's immediate campus area. In fact, it's hard to say for sure, but given what you've said about Berkeley, it's almost certain that wherever those 3,000 people ended up besides Berkeley, it was going to be worse for the environment. So it was a net negative for the goal of preventing carbon from being released into the atmosphere. And it was done in the name of the California Environmental Quality Act.
Well, and I'll add that this whole SB 118 and all the things didn't solve the actual problem. It
didn't make more housing.
It didn't make more housing. And there are existing streamlining tools that we collectively as a community have worked very, very diligently with the legislature in approving infill housing streamlining. And I mean, it's been a topic at AEP for years. We've done full seminar institutes with it. Kristin and the legislative committee have briefed legislators on it and proposed streamlining tools. So CEQA is not to get in the way of infill housing that is supposed to solve this problem.
Yeah.
Well, so so I've defended the media here, and going back to that headline that you read that we started with, I do have a media criticism, and that is the use of the word misuse, which is a normative claim that they're saying that there is a intended purpose of CEQA and that this court case is not it, that this is a distinct misuse of the law. I think, that is certainly an assertion that could be challenged, and B, it's probably not one I would agree with, that assertion. I think the historical record of CEQA, how it was passed, when it was passed, by whom it was passed, is pretty clear. And I think if you were to stare into the abyss on that one, you'd have to conclude that this is exactly how CEQA was intended to be used. They were not public transparency advocates. They were not people whose primary interest was disclosure, although people often say it's a disclosure law, and that is true. The reason for the passage was to stop development. I mean, that was the era of housing law throughout California, in Los Angeles, in Santa Monica, in front
Andy,
of
so then explain
hold on,
why
just let me finish.
So much development occurred from 70 to 80 to 90. That was when we blew up, and it stopped nothing.
Well, it stopped a lot of things in places like the coastal zone, which was, when the coastal height limit in California, in San Diego, was passed, which was a contemporary of CEQA. The creation of the California Coastal Commission prohibited development. It was a contemporary of CEQA. What you did see was quite a bit of sprawl, because perhaps this was unintended, or again, maybe in an ugly way, perhaps it was intended. Turns out the easiest thing to do with CEQA is sprawl.
No, I would disagree with that. But I would say that
there are fewer neighbors to stand up and protest something in an area that isn't already developed, and so
true.
And so I think now this again, I think this is something that people could debate, but was that unintended? Did people not realize that, or were they selfish and they just didn't want development near them? And if it was going to be pushed out into the backcountry, and that the mechanism that they created to as a public disclosure, because these were all First Amendment crusaders, that they did so knowingly. I don't know. You tell me.
I think you're putting too much weight onto CEQA. And I think that CEQA cannot prevent bad planning. And I think when it was first enacted, it was a process, check boxes. But then it became more of a mitigation tool. We started looking at our resources, categorizing our resources, looking at our resources in a regional level. That was a good thing, cannot be denied. And until we had greenhouse gas guidelines and vehicle miles traveled guidelines, you may be right, because people could propose and mitigate whatever they wanted. But until we had guidelines and thresholds that locked us into location, like greenhouse gas does, and the Newhall Ranch decision did, I think you probably could be right. But now as CEQA exists, it does not enable sprawl. I disagree with that.
I disagree.
Those are changes within the last 5 years, right?
10
years. It takes a long time.
I mean,
get those changes.
Yeah, VMT implementation was, yeah.
Well, and
I thought you said greenhouse gas.
Let's continue on to another article whose headline, doesn't say misuse, but says Berkeley case proves CEQA needs to be reformed. That seems to be something that we've all agreed on. Let me continue on a quote. It's a little bit long, so bear with me here, but housing is the top target of CEQA, period. A study of all CEQA lawsuits filed in Southern California over 3 years found more than 14,000 housing units were targeted. Even though environmental advocates want housing to be built at higher densities in urban neighborhoods served by transit, 98% of these CEQA lawsuits challenged projects planned in existing communities. 78% were in transit priority areas, and 70% were in whiter, wealthier, and healthier communities. The quote ends to say, CEQA's inconvenient truth is clear. Courts are used to protect the existing environment against change. So now I know that's a lot of information to react to. My first reaction is, yeah, that makes sense. I've experienced in Southern California where CEQA is used to challenge projects planned in existing communities and in transit priority areas, which is totally the opposite of what you would think it would be used for. And that's why I do think in those cases where it's used as a political tool, as a way to stop things, to challenge things, to drag things out in court, to make it more expensive, that's when I think CEQA is misused, because it's not, the idea isn't to protect whatever baseline conditions or mitigate to a level below significance. The idea there is to prevent what I don't want in my backyard, NIMBYism. And another comment I have is that there is media attention around CEQA most used to prevent development in whiter, wealthier, high resource locations, suggesting that CEQA is effectively being used to uphold our history of redlining and discriminatory housing practices. That's a hefty conversation, but I think that that's true. I think that CEQA is so complicated, so interconnected among resource areas that it is super easy to use it as a political tool in protecting what particular types of populations want. And I do think that that is a misuse, because that isn't the idea behind it. The intent isn't to disclose environmental impacts and reduce them to a level below significance. The idea in that case is to prevent what they don't want. They don't, what particular very specific communities don't want. So with that rambling, Howard, do you have a reaction to those comments?
Well, there were a lot, I will admit. And the last thing you said is the one that I took the notes on. So just the issue that level of significance measurement are all based on really bad thresholds. And those really bad thresholds were developed in the 70s when everything was, as Andy described, being built as suburban sprawl. And so that became the standard. The noise levels are quiet suburban sprawl, the trap, whatever the levels of threshold of significance are, they're all measured and metered towards building suburban sprawl. So when you apply it to the place behind me, they don't fit. You can't make it quiet enough. You can't make it less air pollution. You can't make those thresholds because they're set at suburban levels from the 1970s. And it's very difficult for cities to understand the great power that updating those thresholds will have within the process. Because once again, I think the processes need a reform. I'm not advocating for to get rid of the process. But the points you're making of social justice having very little value in the CEQA's environmental justice trajectory it's time to update it. It's just like anything else. The priorities and the values of the 70s have passed, and the priorities and the values of today are completely different and more urban. And CEQA needs to, like you got before you started in this question, so, oh yeah, 10 years ago we began the level of service, and it takes time. One of you said it takes time to make those changes. Well, the time is right now. So that 10 years from now, we're behind the ball, 10 years from whatever we're trying to do at that time. So it needs to be reformed, or it's just going to get further and further stuck in time and less relevant and more able to get rid of, more able to dismiss if you can't keep up.
I'll also clarify that thresholds of significance get updated regularly by local jurisdictions on an ongoing basis. They're not statewide usually. They're tailored.
No, they're local.
And yeah, they're local. So
which I'd like to hear one in San Diego, one of the 17, whatever cities and county. Anyway, go ahead.
Well, and that's what I also wanted to mention for those of you that are listening and not watching. Howard's background is the city of San Diego, specifically downtown San Diego Bay and Coronado Island that he's referencing. And to that end, CEQA gets updated regularly. And we mentioned that sometimes it takes a really long time because things are extremely complicated and require some engineering and analysis. However, as we saw in the case of SB 118, things can happen very swiftly in a couple weeks should the legislature want it. So when we talk about CEQA reform, I get pretty pumped up because CEQA is, in my professional opinion, a mitigation tool on the back end of a project. It's not how you plan a eco-friendly, sustainable project on the front end. And also, CEQA does not have streamlining benefits for environmentally beneficial projects. Usually, some of it does. And the legislature can make really big changes very quickly, like having CEQA exemptions where you don't have to go through this process for projects.
But exemptions are not reform. Exemptions are not reform.
Well, what
exemptions are just, this thing's not working, so we're going to wipe it out.
It's not things aren't working. It's that politically, I would want a stadium and I would want the Olympics more than I would want. And I'm saying meaning the state of California, would want. Yeah, go ahead, Andy.
Well, yeah. So I think you're getting at something important here. I mean, you're right. Whether it's a stadium or whether it's what they did in Berkeley, it's a hack. It's saying there's this giant bundle of policy, and we don't have the political capital or the political will or the votes to make the necessary changes to holistically change this document. So let's just slap a patch on it and fix this one thing and make these bad headlines go away. And that's bad. But I think underneath of it, it's more revealing than that. And so I'll go back to the story you just described, which I appreciate you reading that had the study and numbers that were necessary to validate the opinion I had stated just like 4 minutes previously. So I'd like the record to reflect that those numbers were put into the public record by me or to my benefit. So when you hear this thing, refer back to that point. Those numbers are for that.
Danny's always right.
So I think there is a fraught assertion in that story though as well, which says environmental advocates said something like, although environmental advocates say that we need dense housing in urban areas, CEQA prevents that from happening. I would say, which environmental advocates? Because it is simply the case that there are plenty of environmental advocates who do not share that belief. Now, you can dispute whether they're right or wrong, but they exist. There's a lot of environmental advocates who are not on the YIMBY train, who have not subscribed to the importance of infill, or they do so only rhetorically, and yet they manage to find a problem with every single infill project because they're a different brand of environmental advocate, or at least they consider themselves an environmental advocate. You can dispute whether they deserve that label, but they call themselves environmental advocates, and what they want is less development, is less growth. And I would further add, those are the environmental advocates that were at the base of CEQA back when it was passed. The no growth movement existed. Reluctant Metropolis by Bill Fulton lays out the history of it quite clearly. These were not infill advocates that were creating a disclosure mechanism to make sure bad projects died and good projects succeeded. They believed that we were headed to an environmental cliff because of population growth, and they wanted to stop it. That is the world out of which this law passed. So I just, maybe the implications here are misuse, that this is not the intent of the law, but we should at least leave room for the possibility that this is exactly what the law is intended to do.
Interesting that you bring that up, because I think we can argue all different sides of the purpose and intent and why and the background and the context for when it was originally proposed and how it's changed over time. The fact is that it does exist today, and it's confusing. And I have another quote that kind of directs or clarifies why it's confusing. For example, Phil Bokovoy, he's the president of Save Berkeley's Neighborhoods in this case. He previously called the SB 118 legislation poorly drafted and confusing. And at the hearing on the matter, he urged lawmakers not to pass SB 118. So again, this is the guy who wants to save Berkeley's neighborhoods, but said don't pass SB 118 to allow the enrollment to increase, because he argued that UC Berkeley does not have the capacity to handle additional students on campus. And he goes on to quote, "Additional students will put more pressure on the local housing market and increase rents for everybody, hitting low-income students and low-income non-student families the hardest. We don't want students to live in cars, campers, and hotel rooms like they've been doing in Santa Barbara. And more students will result in more crowded classes and stretched student support services, making it hard to graduate in 4 years. We'd like to see the legislature instead increase enrollment only after UC has increased housing for their students." I have thoughts on this. I think that he is talking about things that don't relate to CEQA, but I also agree with things that don't hit CEQA is the local housing market increasing rents for everybody. That's not a CEQA matter. And I can understand how you don't want students to live in campers and cars and hotel rooms like they've been doing in Santa Barbara. It's not a CEQA matter that more students will result in more crowded classes. That's not a CEQA matter. Or stretch student support services, not a CEQA matter. That's administrative. Making it hard to graduate in 4 years is not a CEQA matter. Kristin, do you have thoughts?
I think what it brings up is that everyone expects, and I think Andy and Howard are included in this, that to CEQA to solve all the problems of bad planning. And so the purpose, I mean, if you whittle it down, UC Berkeley has a bad plan. They have more students than they can accommodate. So it's not up to CEQA to solve that. And I think that's where the legislators go wrong in their Band-Aid exemptions and their Band-Aid solutions to solving CEQA. Is that like you said, it confuses everything, and it just throws out the whole disclosure and mitigate the impacts. So if you're doing, exempting a whole thing like the Olympics and all of the infrastructure that goes on with that, then, what are you doing? What's the purpose? High-speed rail, same thing.
I like what he said at the end, because after all that, after discussing how all these things aren't CEQA issues, he says, we'd like to see the legislature instead increase enrollment only after UC has increased housing for their students. That would be a better plan, in my opinion, Kristin. Their long-range plan of development, if it addressed housing for their capacity, that would mitigate the issue altogether. But
that puts it to Howard's is that, those students still exist. They just have to live further away.
Right. And it smacks to me of, well, we don't oppose this housing project. We just oppose this housing project until you can build, sufficient public transportation to provide for them. Yeah. Meanwhile, when you propose the public transportation, we're going to oppose that to make sure that you can do it. And it's like, and like, this isn't happening in a vacuum. Berkeley has a fraught history of allowing sufficient housing. I don't think, I don't have complete, awareness of everything that the university has done to build housing over the last 20 years. But I would be surprised to learn that the people who opposed this, that filed this lawsuit, had been staunch advocates for the development of more housing over recent history.
It's the typical infrastructure deficit disorder that's used to say you can't have it. You can't have more people till you have a better water system from, the Colorado River. Okay, thanks. It's disingenuous.
It's interesting that you bring that up. I mean, I think, again, if we simplify it, which I think the media overcomplicates it, but if we simplify it, the point is that increased population density, which is what student enrollment is, student enrollment beyond a threshold is increased population density. So if you're planning if you're doing a community plan or like a form-based code or some sort of urban design effort, yeah, you got it, Howard. You look at population growth and density and the environmental impacts of that density, of that population growth for any development, regardless of its type, and it results in environmental impacts. Now, CEQA isn't saying, no, you have an impact, therefore you shan't do anything. That's not what happens. It just says you have to analyze it and then inform the decision makers who make the decision based on that. And I think in this case, for everyone, not everyone, let me back up a second, for folks to say this is students as pollutants is just missing the whole point. The whole point is that regardless of development, it's population density. And if the UC Berkeley long range plan of development was a general plan for the county of San Diego or general plan for the county of Santa Barbara, and they analyzed population density, but they were going to have more population than what was analyzed in the EIR, that is an impact that needs to be reanalyzed, recirculated, and decided upon. And the legislature in this case said, nope, you don't need to. It's fine. Go ahead. And as a CEQA practitioner, it bothers me that was such a sweeping, easy change because the topic was students. and they just made this like sweeping, easy change. When we have all these other projects in California where there'll be an environmental benefit and will be a well-planned project and be economically supportive and like has these triple bottom line benefits to everything, but don't get CEQA streamlining tools, don't get the attention of the government. And the reason why this case did is because they were literally calling students as pollutants. And what person up for re-election or is going to go, oh, you know what, I disagree. Or, you know, I agree, students are pollutants.
Well, and that's because CEQA doesn't take into account economic benefits and doesn't take into account social justice issues and benefits to right this second, even though that's the reform, or those are the updates that are going to happen right now.
And it's because politics should never play into planning or CEQA, but politics are all over both. And
how is that? But that's not possible if your decision makers are elected officials that have to certify your EIR. That makes it a political act.
If I ruled the world, that's what I would keep out of planning.
Well, I think that
right.
I would love that world, and Kristin, I'm sure that the world that you would be the ruler of would be one I would love to live in for other reasons as well. However,
lots of fish playing.
CEQA is written and passed by politicians. It is interpreted and passed by decision makers who are politicians. Yeah. There's no wishing politics out of this. And you know, I think Laurel's point is spot on, that the politics of Berkeley were such that they had an opportunity to act. And if you go back 10 years to the last time that anybody made a real sustained effort to pursue CEQA reform, which was Governor Jerry Brown, he was tarred by legislators to his left, who were elected officials, as being an enemy of the environment for daring to propose, a more complete CEQA reform proposal. And so, you know, I guess what I would say is, back to my point that which environmental advocates are, agree that these changes are necessary. Not many of the ones who are in the state assembly and the state senate whose votes are required to make the sorts of big changes, and rather you have the votes for essentially the spot zoning applied to CEQA. Spot exemptions are the easy political answer to a otherwise difficult political problem.
And so,
and one other political, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
One other political problem that hasn't been mentioned is Berkeley is there's an underlying long-standing town gown issues that happen with most universities located in a smallish town, and the town gown issues you're not going to overcome, as Kristin says. CEQA is not going to overcome those sorts of issues. So there's lots of those types of issues, not just town gown, but suburban shopping center versus suburban shopping center, labor versus the chamber. All those issues exist in every city all across California. And CEQA can't solve for that. They just can, like Andy hasn't said yet, but the disclosure is there's quite a bit of information that's put out into the public with environmental documents that help the idea of how to mitigate for population increases and what are the issues we have to solve for in our certain region, which are extremely important and extremely informative. However, that doesn't mean that makes for better planning. Actually, though, I do have a problem with CEQA practitioners doing a lot of planning after the initial plan is done, because we do not do a good job of planning and public process in the planning realm to develop that project description at the beginning, towards the beginning, and working together with the CEQA planning practitioners to come up with the right alternatives once the environmental issues are analyzed and disclosed that weren't done at the front end. So instead of spending, instead of spending a lot of money to get two different plans over the same period of time, you can spend less money and less time to come up with those preferred plan and scenarios that push it either way. in one process, but we separate them into two, and the back end gets most of the best planning, which is why you don't see the best planning, because CEQA practitioners are not master planning, site design, urban planning professionals.
Mm-hmm. The same, yeah, and the converse is true, because master planners, urban designers aren't environmental experts or environmental
Have no idea.
Yeah. So I think
right. What are the thresholds? We don't even know what the thresholds are. We just complain about them.
This is a really good opportunity, I think, to wrap up on a positive note. So we have discussed how none of us want to throw CEQA out the window. There are, I imagine in our CEQA series, we're gonna talk about, we're gonna bring some other people on the podcast that are going to talk about how the media and some politicians every year, they're always proposing, just get rid of CEQA altogether. So that's not what this panel believes. We concur that CEQA needs to be reformed. We concur that it has a purpose and intent, but it needs to be reformed. So on a positive note, I want to go around the panel, and I want you to provide me 1-2-ish solutions. Like, if you had your way, what would you change? For example, Howard just mentioned it's really a good idea to have environmental professionals and master planners at the start of a project to develop the project description. That might solve a lot of our problems that we try to mitigate on the back end. And quite frankly, it's more efficient. It reduces our negative externalities of the whole process altogether. So that's one. I will also add onto that I would love more streamlining tools for environmentally beneficial projects. I think it's possible, and we can do that. And another solution I have is more people being educated in the technicalities of CEQA, like maybe more CEQA practitioners come join the Association of Environmental Professionals. Membership is free for students. Come learn and be a part of it, and join Kristin's committee in the legislature, where you educate lawmakers about the unintended consequences of CEQA changes. And with that, I'll pass it over to Andy. Maybe 1 or 2 solutions that you want to share.
Frankly, I think solutions might not be the best world for me as a non-practitioner. But I'll say this, is that I think that we can quibble about what's intended and what's unintended, but outcomes are real, and we can observe them, and we can describe them clearly. And the outcomes that result from a process, if we do not like them, that process is made by men and women and can be changed by men and women. And that is something that we should be open to rather than defensive of. And so I think whether it's what we've described in Berkeley or a situation here in San Diego that Kristin has described as a failure of people who were involved in the process, which is there's a sports arena redevelopment project that lost in court on a CEQA case because very, very, very wealthy people who live up on a hill over top of this blighted area that was attempted to be redeveloped into many homes and many affordable homes. It was thrown out because the city did not adequately study what it would do to the views of the wealthy people who live up on the hill, looking out over this blighted area if they had tall buildings there. And that happened. That's a result of CEQA, and we can decide that the people who were in charge of that project did a bad job. But we could also change the law so that we don't have to require people to do a great job all the time and can be more accommodating of mistakes, because there's a lot of public officials in this city, in this state, and they're not all going to be exemplary at all times. Just like basketball players and journalists and police officers and meter maids, they may in fact make mistakes, and we should do our best to achieve the outcomes we want without having people to be perfect at their jobs.
That is an interesting point. Thank you, Andy. Howard?
I, for one, do not make mistakes, just so you know.
I mean, what I took away from Andy's point also was engagement. When you engage in these processes, you have an impact on the outcomes, or you can influence outcomes, and outcomes are real, and we observe those things. So I really hope that listeners are empowered to be more involved, because things like this are happening on a real-time basis, all the way from the meter maids all the way up to the governor. Like, you have an impact on all the things. So thanks, Andy. I like the positive note. Howard, positive note?
A positive note for me that I could think of is there is attempt to reform the subsidized opposition using CEQA and an EIR opposition from community groups, where they get a free pass to say, yeah, you could appeal any decision using CEQA to the next level of decision maker for free, and rely upon and use CEQA as part of your tool for that. And I think that the barrier of entry to oppose things should be much higher to reflect the a causation or the whatever the outcome might end up being that could be extremely important to a region or a downtown or a block. And so and that's been attempted locally through local reform, and I think that that would be a good change that would help people understand exactly the impacts of what they're doing when they're opposing something using these rules.
That's a good idea.
Yeah, Kristin, bring us home.
All right, I'll be quick. I would increase the infill exemption. The amount that is allowed right now, I think, is 200, and it's just way too low. That is
a tool to keep you from building housing, because nobody wants to build less than 200 and manage apartments.
We agree. Yes. And then overall, I would just simplify CEQA. I would just take my simple mind and just cover it all with simplicity. So
thank you.
That's hard to do.
It's very complicated making things simple. Thank you all for investing your time in the AEP community and sharing your professional opinions, your expertise. This has been highly engaging, and I hope that we can have you back to talk about more changes that we want in the future. And I just want to say again, I really appreciate all of you. And to the listeners out there, if you want to be a person in this field, making arguments, talking about things, making changes, really consider joining the Association of Environmental Professionals, where you can have another avenue of having an impact on these issues. Thanks, everyone, so much. Appreciate you.
Thanks for having us, Laurel.
Thank you. Guys. That was fun.
We hope you enjoyed this episode. As a new podcast, it really helps us if you share with friends and colleagues that may enjoy this podcast as well. And please subscribe or follow the podcast to be alerted for new episodes. If you want to submit a shout out, please send a voice memo that's under 1 minute to podcast@califAEP.org. That's podcast with an S at the end, podcast@califAEP.org. Or please send any feedback you'd love to share. Thank you.